There's a particular kind of dread that creeps in when someone you love misses a phone call they always make. Not a meeting, not an appointment, just the routine check in that's so reliable you've stopped thinking about it. That's the dread Elaine Sobek felt on the evening of November 16th, 1995, when her 27-year-old daughter Linda didn't ring her back. Linda had called that morning to say she was running late for a quick photo shoot, but promised she'd phone again that night to nail down plans for a family barbecue the following weekend. She never did, and within 48 hours, a maintenance crew working the Angeles National Forest would find pictures of a smiling young woman tossed into a roadside trash bin. Soon, a freelance photographer would be telling a story to police that didn't quite add up, and the truth, when it came out, was far worse than anyone could have guessed. Linda Sobek had been chasing the same dream as half of Los Angeles County, and by the autumn of 1995, she was closer to catching it than most. Born in July of 1968 and raised in Lakewood, she'd spent roughly 5 years on the sidelines of the Coliseum as a Raiderette, the Los Angeles Raiders cheer dance squad. She was named Raiderette of the Year during her third season. At 5'4", she was too short for runway work, but her looks made her a fixture in other forms of modeling: swimwear layouts, calendar shoots, car magazine spreads, and more. She'd picked up bit parts on screen too, small roles that paid the rent while she waited for the call that might actually change things. That phone call had come only days before she vanished, and she'd booked a recurring guest spot on Married with Children, the kind of credit that opens doors in Hollywood. A costume fitting for the show was on her calendar for the afternoon of November 16th, and she'd already told the producers she'd be a little late getting in because of the photo shoot. By that fall, Linda was sharing a 4-bedroom house in Hermosa Beach with 3 other women working in or around the entertainment business. She kept careful records of her bookings in a day planner she carried everywhere. Friends would later describe her as a model who treated the work like a business rather than a fantasy. She was the sort of person who told people where she was going, when she'd be back, and who she'd be with, which is exactly what makes what happened next so chilling. The job had come together fast. Only a day earlier, Linda had taken a call from a photographer she'd worked with before. He was a tall, heavy-set man named Charles Rathbun, then 38, who specialized in automotive shoots and had a small but legitimate-looking portfolio with several car publications. Rathbun said he had a same-day assignment to photograph a prototype Lexus sport utility vehicle and that he needed a model on the call sheet. He reportedly told her the assignment was for Auto Week magazine, which had a circulation of about 300,000 magazines per week at the time. This was, at least the way Rathbun sold it, a pretty big job for an up-and-coming model like Linda. The publisher of that magazine would later flatly contradict the claim, telling reporters that Auto Week didn't use models in its product shoots. It would later be confirmed that the assignment Rathbun had taken on with the manufacturer never involved any model at all. But here's the thing, he was an established photographer with a legitimate prototype Lexus and a real assignment to take pictures of it. The job on his end was real, which presumably made the ruse all the more realistic, but he used that prototype to target Linda. Linda, of course, had no way of knowing any of that, and they agreed to meet for breakfast the next morning at a Denny's restaurant in Torrance. She woke up early on November 16th and made 2 calls. The first was to her mother. The second was to her booker, confirming the day's schedule. She told both women the same thing: a quick shoot in the desert, back in time for the costume fitting. She walked out the door, met Rathbun at the Denny's, and climbed into a black pre-production Lexus SUV, a vehicle so new it hadn't yet been released to dealerships. The plan, according to Rathbun, was to drive out to the El Mirage dry lake bed in the western Mojave, run a few hours of action shots, and head home. The dry lake bed sits roughly 2 hours from the South Bay, a flat white expanse where automotive photographers love to shoot because there's nothing in the frame except sky and dust. Whatever happened that day didn't happen there. By the time Linda's mother started worrying, her daughter was already deep in the Angeles National Forest, north of Los Angeles. When Linda missed her costume fitting that afternoon, a close friend named Brooke Morales started calling around. Linda didn't ghost call sheets, and she didn't miss bookings, so this was highly unusual to say the least. By the morning of November 17th, Elaine had filed a missing persons report with the Hermosa Beach Police Department. A small group of Linda's friends and former Raiderette teammates had started running their own search, printing flyers, working the phones, and walking the neighborhoods near her house. The story got into the Los Angeles Times within 72 hours, and local television picked it up. A pretty former cheerleader vanished on her way to a photo shoot was the kind of story that didn't stay buried for long. Volunteers from the Montrose Search and Rescue Team were called out to comb the canyons north of the city, working off the theory that Linda had been driven somewhere remote. Nobody quite knew where to start looking, because nobody yet knew where she'd actually been. The break came not from the searchers, but from a county maintenance worker doing routine trash pickup along a forest road north of the city. Sometime around November 18th, he came across an odd collection of items dumped into a roadside bin. There were photographs of a young woman posing professionally, a daily planner with the page for November 16th torn out, and a piece of paper that turned out to be a vehicle lease contract. The contract authorized a freelance photographer named Charles Rathbun to borrow a prototype Lexus for what the document described as an Auto Week assignment. The maintenance worker didn't think much of it at the time, but a few days later, watching the news, he saw the missing woman's face and recognized her instantly from the photos. He called the sheriff's department, and that call cracked the case open in roughly the time it took investigators to drive to Rathbun's apartment in Hollywood. He'd already returned the Lexus to the manufacturer on November 20th, but a forensic team got into it before it could be cleaned by the manufacturer. Despite obvious signs that the interior had been scrubbed carefully, technicians recovered traces of blood. They also recovered fibers and a pattern of soil consistent with the back roads of the Angeles National Forest. Rathbun, meanwhile, was at home, and he wasn't behaving like an innocent man. He told the first detectives who reached him that he'd met Linda for breakfast at the Denny's, decided she wasn't quite right for the shoot, and parted ways with her in the parking lot. Then, almost as an aside, he reportedly said something he had no business knowing. He told them he must have been the last person to see her alive. But here's the thing. Investigators hadn't even told her she was suspected to be deceased. Now I probably don't have to tell you that this instantly made him the prime suspect in her disappearance, if he wasn't occupying that slot already. Charles Rathbun was a freelance photographer of the kind any modeling agent in Los Angeles would have called a known quantity. He'd shot for several legitimate publications, and he had both a portfolio and references. He was also, as it turned out, a man with a long shadow trailing behind him. Investigators digging into his background uncovered a 1979 incident in Ohio in which a young Kroger co-worker reported being assaulted in his home. He had invited her in to look at his photography and discuss modeling opportunities, but it was all a ruse. Unfortunately, though, for reasons that aren't quite clear, he was never prosecuted for this crime. They found a pattern of accusations stretching across the Midwest, including a stint as a student at Ohio State University that overlapped with the 1994 disappearance of an OSU freshman. He had an address in the Lansing area that overlapped with the 1993 disappearance of a young Michigan model named Rose Larner. Closer to home, Rathbun's name had come up at least once in connection with the 1992 case of Kimberly Pandelios. She was a young Southern California model whose body had been found in the same general region under broadly similar circumstances. He'd never been charged in any of those cases, and other suspects would eventually surface in some of them, but the resemblance to what had just happened to Linda was hard to ignore. In the Larner and Pandelios cases specifically, other people were eventually charged and convicted, but it's clear that the cops already had him pinned as a potential serial predator. While detectives were still working out how to approach him, Rathbun made the next move substantially easier. While under surveillance, he reportedly fired a weapon in his own driveway, a shot that ricocheted and grazed the arm of a female acquaintance who was with him at the time. That gave Los Angeles authorities grounds to enter the residence, conduct a search, and detain him. I've said it once before, and I'll say it again. We're very lucky that criminals tend not to be the brightest people around. Perhaps, though, it's not an intelligence issue, but rather hubris, the belief that no matter what they do, they're untouchable. At any rate, I just can't imagine that he wouldn't have at least thought he might have been under police surveillance at the time. But I'm getting off track here. Inside, they found a massive cache of weaponry, ammunition, restraints, packing tape, and bottles of alcohol bundled into what looked unsettlingly like a kit. They also found photographs of women they couldn't immediately identify. The theory developed that Charles Rathbun was keeping these pictures as some sort of trophy related to his previous victims. I'll get into this more in a moment, but somewhat surprisingly, this actually may not have been the case, or I should say, it's never been proven that this is what these photos were. Once he was in custody, Rathbun's account of November 16th began evolving in real time, which generally isn't the behavior of a man with nothing to hide. The first version was the one he'd already given, that they had parted ways at the Denny's. The second version was that he'd taken Linda out to the desert after all, and she'd been struck and fatally injured by the Lexus. He claimed that he leapt into the driver's seat to demonstrate a high-speed turn and lost control of the vehicle while doing donuts. He was, of course, getting slightly closer to the truth with this one, but he was trying to frame it all as an accident, just a big mistake. The medical examiner who eventually examined the body would find no broken bones consistent with a vehicle strike. The third version was that the contact had been intimate and the asphyxiation had been accidental, the kind of thing that happens in consensual encounters that go wrong. The fourth version was that there had been an argument and a struggle, and that the asphyxiation had still somehow been accidental, just under different circumstances. Each version was offered as if it were the first, and each one steered detectives a little further from the only piece of evidence that mattered, the location of Linda's body. If they had her body, they could prove what actually happened to her, and detectives had a hunch that there was nothing accidental about Linda's fate. Then the lead detective, Raul Saldana, did something brilliant to get justice for Linda and her family. He implied that he agreed that it was all one big awful accident, but that Linda's family needed her body so that they could lay her to rest. Somehow, Rathbun bought this hook, line, and sinker, and this would be his unraveling. On November 24th, 8 days after she'd vanished, Rathbun finally agreed to lead detectives into the Angeles National Forest. He took them to a shallow grave on a wooded slope and watched as deputies dug. They found Linda, and the autopsy concluded that she'd been asphyxiated and that she had also sustained blunt force trauma to the head. She had been subjected to other forms of disturbing assault beyond what initially passed for the central crime. Her blood alcohol level was measured at almost twice the threshold for legal intoxication. The case went to trial in Los Angeles County in the autumn of 1996 and ran for roughly 5 weeks. The prosecution didn't have an eyewitness, but it didn't need one. It had the photographs in the trash, the planner, the lease contract, the cleaned car that wouldn't quite come clean, the changing stories, and the comment about being the last person to see her. They also had the implements found in the apartment, and the body Rathbun himself had led detectives to. The jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts, and on December 16, 1996, Charles Rathbun was sentenced to life in a California state prison without the possibility of parole. What's never been formally answered, and what remains an unsolved mystery, is whether Linda Sobek was the first young woman he did this to, or only the last. Investigators in Ohio, Michigan, and California spent years trying to clear or close the cases his movement seemed to brush up against. However, a handful of those cases have since resolved without his name attached. The Pandelios case in particular was eventually solved with a different suspect entirely, which complicates the easy serial predator narrative that built up around Rathbun. Personally, I don't think Linda was his first victim, but proving that seems incredibly difficult at this point. That said, it's possible that his other criminal activities were simply all leading up to this event, that he'd wanted to take a life, but for whatever reason hadn't done so until he met Linda. What isn't in dispute is that Linda Sobek, on the last morning of her life, did everything anyone could reasonably ask. She'd told her mother where she was going and confirmed the day's schedule with her booker. She hadn't put her trust in someone who wasn't a known quantity. She was going on a professional shoot with a real photographer. Unfortunately, it still wasn't enough, because the man waiting for her at that Denny's had been quietly rehearsing for the moment for longer than anyone yet realized. 3 friends are having drinks in a heated garage in rural Wisconsin, and 2 of them are listening to the third tell hunting stories. Then, mid-conversation, the third one calmly says he hopes they'll forgive him if he has to put them both down, and he's reaching for the weapon before the sentence is finished. The town of Germania sits west of Tigerton in Shawano County, Wisconsin. It's the kind of place where deer season is a real season on the calendar, and where folks down the road from each other tend to know one another's pickup trucks. Rick Roundy lived there, and the evening of November 12th, 2025, carried the same low-key rhythm that defined a lot of his nights. Roundy had a detached garage on his property, and inside it he'd built a small bar. It wasn't fancy. There were a few stools and not much more. It was somewhere to land after a day in the woods. That night, his closest hunting partner was over. The man court documents would later refer to only as victim number 2. The 2 had planned on talking through stories from the deer season and unwinding, just regular stuff, nothing special. The third man at the bar was Brent Hoffman. He was 74, lived just down the road, and had hunted with both of them for more than a decade. By victim number 2's account, Hoffman had always been a bit of an oddball, a hermit, a bit weird, but never trouble. Not once, in all those years on adjoining hunting land, had there been a fight or a flare-up or even a sharp word between them. Hoffman showed up that evening with a big iron on his hip, and the surviving hunter would later tell investigators that he seemed to be drinking heavily by the time he sat down. That wasn't unusual in itself, and Hoffman was often pretty heavy into the bottle by the time the men got together. The 3 of them poured drinks and settled in around the bar. They talked deer hunting, the way men in northern Wisconsin do when the weather starts to turn. By every account given to the Shawano County Sheriff's Office, nothing about that conversation was tense, and nothing was off-color or accusatory. There was no buried grudge surfacing, and there were no disputes between any of them. It was just an ordinary night. Then, without warning, Hoffman said something that made the air go cold. According to the criminal complaint, he told the other 2, quote, "I hope you'll excuse me if I have to kill you guys." Victim number 2 told deputies the comment came out of nowhere, that Hoffman had never said anything remotely like it before. Then, after delivering his seemingly quote unquote polite statement, Hoffman started blasting. The shots came without buildup or warning, and they caught Ricky Roundy as he came around a corner of the garage. Roundy went down. The surviving victim watched it happen, then bolted into the main house and locked the door behind him. He grabbed a Ruger that he kept on the property, loaded it, and sat down on an ottoman near a glass door, and from there, he called the cops. The dispatcher could hear everything. Victim number 2 told the operator that a man named Brent had shot his friend, that he didn't know if his friend was still alive. He told her that if Brent tried to come into the house, he'd shoot. The 911 call captured the next several seconds in real time. Glass shattered. The victim fired, by the district attorney's later account, twice. He told the dispatcher he thought Brent had gone down. Police later determined that Hoffman had pursued victim number 2 from the garage to the main house and had tried to get inside. The surviving man had fired through the glass pane of the door, sending shards into Hoffman's face and head. By the time deputies pulled into the driveway, the man who'd opened fire in the garage ambush needed serious medical attention. And I have to say, the mugshot of Brent Hoffman is horrific, and I've never really seen an injury like that before. It appears as though this was caused by glass shattering into his eyes, though it's not entirely clear from the reporting on it so far. When Shawano County deputies arrived, they found a man propped against the side of the house, bleeding from his face. He identified himself as Brent, and he denied having a weapon, but then admitted he had an empty holster on his hip. He asked the deputy why he'd been shot by the cops, and the deputy told him that police hadn't fired a single round. According to the report, Hoffman responded with, "Thank you," and "I love you," the kind of phrase a person says when they're either deeply confused or trying to play a role. Inside the detached garage, deputies found Ricky Roundy. Sadly, he'd succumbed to multiple shots, according to the autopsy referenced in the complaint, and there was nothing the first responders could do for him. At the Shawano County Jail, when officers told him he was being processed for slaying his friend, he reportedly responded that he'd never hurt anybody. Shawano County District Attorney Gregory Parker didn't dance around what the file showed. He told the court plainly that what had happened in that garage was a slaying in cold blood. Hoffman was charged with first-degree intentional homicide, as well as the same sort of charges for what he attempted to do to victim number 2. At his first court appearance on November 18, 2025, the state asked for $1 million cash bond. Hoffman's attorney, Eric Makalek, argued for a quarter of that, telling the court that the facts of the case were perplexing and that his client didn't appear to be a flight risk. The judge sided with the prosecution, and Hoffman was also ordered to have no contact with the victims' families and no contact with the surviving hunter. He was also ordered to surrender all weapons, forbidden from travel outside Wisconsin, and to maintain absolute sobriety while the case moved forward. Those last terms wouldn't be necessary, since as it turned out, he wasn't going to post bail, and instead he sat rotting in the slammer through the winter and into the spring. On May 21, 2026, Hoffman appeared in court again and entered a plea of not guilty to both counts. Roundy's family released a statement through a spokesperson in the days after his passing. They described him as a wonderful man whose untimely loss had devastated everyone close to him, thanked the community for the outpouring of support, and asked, plainly, for privacy. The legal filings stacking up across Shawano were, by then, doing all the talking for them. For me, I think the most unsettling part of the file is the absence at the center of it, since there's no motive in the criminal complaint and no precipitating argument. The surviving hunter sat across from investigators and told them, plainly, that he could not think of a single thing that could have turned the evening into a sudden act of violence. Hoffman himself, in his own words to deputies, denied that anything had happened at all. In most cases like this, even the ones that look senseless on a headline, you can usually trace the evening backward and find the snag, the moment something tightened. This case doesn't appear to have one, at least not yet. 3 men sat down to have a drink and talk about deer, and only 2 of them got to walk out of that garage. Personally, and this is just speculation on my part, I do have to wonder if there was some sort of conflict brewing underneath that hasn't come to the surface yet. I have to question whether Hoffman may have began acting bizarrely as some sort of cover for the true cause of the attack, or as a potential ill-thought-out defense. Some people have this false idea that if you just act crazy or deranged enough, you'll somehow escape legal culpability for your actions. Or perhaps I'm just looking for some way to explain a truly random and disturbed act and somehow make it make sense. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy with my usual reminder to hit that subscribe button and the notification bell if you're enjoying my content. Also, don't forget to share this video with your friends and family who enjoy true crime content, cold cases, and mysteries. On October 21st, 1996, a park ranger pushing into one of the more remote canyons of Death Valley spotted something glinting in the wash. It was a green minivan, sunk to its axles, 3 tires flat. The doors were closed and the keys were gone. Inside he found German-language brochures and an American flag that seemed to be entirely out of place. The 4 people who'd driven the van into the canyon were already long gone, and for the next 13 years, nobody would know what had really happened to them. The family had touched down at SeaTac Airport on July 8, 1996, then connected to Los Angeles, where they collected the keys to a brand new green Plymouth Voyager. There were 4 of them, all from Dresden in the former East Germany. Egbert Rimkus was 34, an architect with a love of the outdoors, and at least one prior trip to the American Southwest behind him. His girlfriend, Cornelia Meyer, was 27. Each had brought 1 child along, Egbert's 11-year-old son, George Weber, and Cornelia's 4-year-old son, Max Meyer. They had a return flight booked from LAX on July 27th, giving them about 2.5 weeks to roam the western parks. On July 22nd, they pulled into Death Valley and stopped at the Furnace Creek Visitor Center, where they picked up a German-language park guide. That night, they camped near Telescope Peak in Hanaupa Canyon, already well off the standard tourist track. The next morning, they headed deeper into the backcountry. They poked around an abandoned mining settlement called Warm Spring. Cornelia signed the dusty visitor logbook on behalf of all 4 of them. Underneath the signatures, she added a short note in German, and the translation amounts to a casual line saying they were heading over the pass. The pass, almost certainly, was Mengel. Mengel Pass is one of the more punishing routes in a region that is famous for its inhospitable environment. It's a rugged 4-wheel drive track that climbs out of Butte Valley over a saddle of broken rock and drops into Goler Wash on the far side. Locals who know the area will tell you that even modified off-road vehicles get hung up on it. A rented suburban minivan was, to put it mildly, the wrong machine for the job. The family had been pushing their luck for hours by then. Before tackling the pass, they'd stopped at Butte Valley's geologist's cabin, a tiny stone refuge built around 1930 by a prospector named Asa Russell. When investigators later got inside the abandoned van, they found a small American flag tucked among the family's belongings. That flag had been taken from the cabin, where it usually flew as an informal marker for anyone who happened to find the place. What happened after they crested Mengel has to be inferred, because no one saw them alive again. The likeliest scenario is that they descended the western side, realized the terrain was even worse than what they'd just come through, and decided to loop back rather than retrace their steps. Their German language map showed a tempting shortcut back into the main valley through a place called Anvil Spring Canyon. On paper, the canyon road appeared perfectly navigable, but on the ground, it absolutely wasn't. When the Rangers spotted the Plymouth Voyager that day, it was sitting in the wash of Anvil Canyon, about 2.5 miles below Willow Spring. The vehicle was lodged up to its axles in soft sand, and both rear tires were flat, as was the front left. Tracks in the wash showed the family had tried to keep driving for at least 200 feet after the rear tires failed, gouging the bare rims into the canyon floor before the van gave up. Inside, the scene was almost domestic. There were clothes and toys, the German park guide, toiletries, food wrappers, and that little American flag from the geologist's cabin. The keys were gone, which meant whoever had walked away from the van had done so deliberately. They locked up the way a tourist locks up at a trailhead before heading off for a quick look around. Except the look around, in this case, was an attempt to walk out of one of the harshest landscapes in North America in the middle of July. The search was substantial, and helicopters crisscrossed the canyons for days. Ground teams swept the most obvious escape routes on foot, working their way back up toward Butte Valley and north toward Warm Spring. Those were the corridors any experienced desert hiker would have considered, but they turned up nothing. The official theory eventually hardened around the idea that the German family had walked one of those familiar routes and succumbed to the heat. They had later been buried under sand or debris by a flash flood, and with no remains and no leads, the case went cold. And that's where this case would have likely stayed forever, but for the obsession of one man. But I'll get to that in a brief moment. Back in Germany, the families of Egbert and Cornelia were left in the worst kind of limbo. Bank balances stopped moving, and the credit cards never registered another charge. The return flight from Los Angeles to Frankfurt on July 27th left without any of them aboard, and the rental company eventually reported the Green Voyager as overdue. There was no ransom demand and no bodies, just an empty van rusting in a canyon 9,000 kilometers from home. Tabloids in Europe floated theories that the family had faked their own disappearance or had been caught up in some crime ring, but none of it held together. The bleakest possibility was always the likeliest, though it perhaps doesn't move papers in the way a crime ring does. 4 people had vanished into a desert that swallows people regularly, and the trail had gone stone cold because the environment swallowed them up. That's where things would have stayed if not for a retired aerospace engineer named Tom Mahood. He's a search and rescue volunteer in Southern California with a serious interest in cold cases. In 2009, after digging through the Inyo County Sheriff's records and spending months going over topographic maps, the light bulb went off. Mahood came around to a conclusion the original searchers had ruled out as a waste of time. The official assumption was that the German family wouldn't have walked south, further into the wilderness, because no rational person familiar with the area ever would. Mahood thought that was exactly the assumption that had doomed the search, since they weren't behaving rationally and they weren't familiar with the environment. They were exhausted, panicking foreign tourists with no sense of scale in a landscape unlike anything back home in Europe. The fact that they took a van on such an expedition should have perhaps been the first clue that all rationality should be tossed aside. From the van's location, the topography offers a deceptive view. A wash that seems to lead somewhere, and mountains that look closer than they are. Add into this the fact that even rational and experienced hikers in these sorts of situations make what appear to be paradoxical decisions. If they'd seen the outline of the China Lake Naval Weapons Station marked off to the south on their map, they might have convinced themselves they could hike out that way. The reality is that the route is roughly 25 miles of brutal, waterless desert, an absolute wasteland. On November 12, 2009, Mahood and a fellow hiker named Les Walker were working a search grid in that exact direction when Walker called over he had found bones. Scattered around them were items the searchers recognized from old case photos: a Sprite bottle, fragments of clothing, sandals, the spine of a German-English dictionary, and a wine bottle. Again, some of these items really give you clues that this family wasn't properly provisioned for what they were attempting to do. Meyer's passport was still legible after 13 years in the open, as was her bank card. The two adult skeletons were later identified through their belongings and through dental records sent over from Germany. Other remains were also recovered in the same area, but had been too long exposed to the desert sun for a positive identification. From the location of the remains, and from a trail of discarded personal items scattered between the van and the final site, it's possible to roughly sketch the family's last hours on foot. They had walked roughly 6 miles cross-country in extreme heat, away from any reliable water sources. They had carried what they could grab from the vehicle, and the 4-year-old almost certainly had to be carried himself for long stretches by one of the adults. They appear to have stopped at one point, possibly to wait out the worst of the daytime heat in the shadow of a rock outcrop, before pushing on toward an empty horizon. The final site sits in a shallow wash with partial shade, but no real escape from temperatures that climb well past 120 degrees Fahrenheit by mid-afternoon. The straight-line distance from that final resting site to the nearest paved road today is still more than a dozen miles of open desert without a single reliable spring along the way. In the end, the disappearance of the Death Valley Germans was almost certainly not a crime, but a brutal lesson in how deceptive desert danger can be. From a map, the route may have looked survivable. From the van, the mountains may have looked close. The wash may have looked like a path, and the open horizon may have suggested rescue was only a hard walk away. But the valley doesn't reveal its scale honestly. Distances stretch, heat destroys judgment, shade is rare, and a dry canyon that looks passable can become a trap. The family had already driven deep into terrain their vehicle was never meant to handle, and once the van failed, every choice became worse than the last. Theories about escape, foul play, or criminal involvement made for dramatic speculation, but the evidence points to something simpler and sadder. These were 4 tourists overwhelmed by an unforgiving landscape, but of course that undersells what happened to a certain degree. While 2 of these people ought to have known better, I can't help think of Max and George in those last moments, and how unfair and tragic the entire event was. But that's not really to blame the parents here either, at least not fully, since education about the danger of desert environments is remarkably poor. Deserts are some of the most inhospitable places on Earth, and even well-provisioned, experienced hikers perish fairly frequently in situations like this. I can't help but think that today such a tragedy could have been avoided by a simple, quick Google search, but sadly, information was harder to come by at the time.